10 million soldiers dead, 23 million wounded. The loss of life was greater than any previous war in history, shocking the countries involved and decimating their young male populations. But when the war started, nobody predicted that this was going to happen. So why did the brutality of the First World War take everyone by surprise? And why was it quite so bloody? In this video, I'll go through the 6 factors that uniquely combine to create a style of warfare that was one of the worst and most tragic ever seen, one that left millions dead and the world reeling in horror. Then at the end of the video, I'll discuss why this war completely altered the course of civilization and created the modern world. Let's get started. Chapter 1. Pre-war ideals. The world before the deluge. First, let's set the stage. It's the early 20th century. Europe is bustling with optimism. Cities are growing, technology is advancing, and there's a widespread belief in progress. Railroads are connecting continents, industries are booming, and everyone's convinced they're living in the most advanced era humanity has ever known. It's a golden age, or at least it looks like one. This sense of progress means that many Europeans thought they were beyond the barbarism of the past. War? Oh, that was seen as something noble, even chivalrous. The attitude to warfare at this time was more akin to sport than what we think of as war. The previous 100 years had been lived in relative peace, and most memories of war harked back to the Napoleonic times, you know, where gentlemen sat on hills and watched the battles play out below them like they were elaborate games. War was considered glorious, soldiers had high social prestige, and the military had a big influence in everyday life. It was a quick affair fought by men with shining swords, or at least that's what they thought. Unfortunately for them, it's this glorification of war that is our first factor in why this war was so shocking, and it will rock these societies so tremendously hard that they're never the same again. Before the war, European powers leaned hard into national pride. The militaries were seen as the ultimate symbol of a nation's strength and honour. Boys grew up idolising soldiers as the epitome of bravery and manhood. Governments and monarchs reinforced this. Fight for your country, they said, and you'll return a hero. Schools taught children that war was a rite of passage. Even writers and poets romanticised it. Think of Rudyard Kipling's lines, "If you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs." It's stirring stuff, but it doesn't mention mustard gas or gangrene. This glorification wasn't just cultural, it was deeply embedded in politics. Nationalism was the name of the game. Countries were locked in a competition to prove their supremacy. The big players, Britain, France, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Russia, were all jostling for position on the world stage. And when you're playing a game of my empire's bigger than yours, war starts looking less like a tragedy and more like an opportunity. But these major powers were all under the illusion that this war would be quick. When tensions began to escalate in 1914, the prevailing idea was that it would all be over by Christmas. Military planners on both sides were confident. They believed they had the right strategies, the right weapons, and the right men to secure a decisive victory in just a few months. Why? Well, because Europe had been relatively peaceful since the Napoleonic Wars a century earlier. Sure, there were conflicts here and there, but nothing on a massive scale. People had forgotten what large-scale warfare looks like. To them, war wasn't trenches and artillery barrages, it was parades and glory. Then came the alliances. Arguably the most disastrous game of political Jenga ever played. The major powers had tied themselves to smaller nations in a web of treaties and agreements. If one domino fell, the rest was sure to follow. When Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, Germany stepped in to back Austria-Hungary. Russia moved to support Serbia. France joined Russia, Germany invaded Belgium to get to France, and Britain declared war on Germany for invading Belgium. What began as a localized conflict spiraled into a continent-wide disaster, thanks to a system that was supposed to prevent war. So imagine this for a moment. You're an 18-year-old in 1914. You've seen the recruitment posters, heard the stirring speeches. You're filled with patriotism. You think, this is my chance to be a hero, to make my family proud, to come home wearing a medal. And you're not alone. Millions of young men across Europe think the same thing. Would you have signed up? It's easy to say no now, but back then, swept up in the propaganda and the ideals of the time, you might well have been on the first train to the front. Let's now take a look at why this war was so uniquely brutal. Chapter 2. Industrialised warfare. War meets the machine.
If pre-war ideals set the stage, industrialised warfare tore down the curtains, burned the props and turned the play into a bloodbath.
World War I wasn't just a war of soldiers. It was a war of factories, assembly lines, and science. For the first time in history, humanity unleashed its full industrial might on the battlefield, and the results were horrifying.
Let's start with the sheer scale.
In previous wars, the fighting was done by small, professional armies. However, for the first time in history, these nations were able to deploy millions and millions of men to the field because of the industrialization their societies had seen over the last century. Therefore, the armies in this war were by far the largest ever seen, with men mobilized from every corner of society.
However, in World War I, it wasn't just about the men, it was about machines.
Factories didn't just churn out guns, they churned out death. New technology like machine guns, heavy artillery, tanks, aeroplanes, flamethrowers, and poison gas turned the battlefield into a science experiment in destruction. Take the machine gun, for example. One of these could fire 500 to 600 rounds per minute. Imagine that. A single machine gun could decimate entire waves of soldiers. And this wasn't just some rare elite weapon, it was mass-produced, affordable, and horrifyingly efficient. Then there was the artillery. Pre-industrial cannons were big and scary, sure, but technology had come on a long way, and World War I artillery was on another level. These beasts could fire shells miles away, obliterating entire towns and trench systems in minutes. Soldiers in the trenches weren't just fighting each other, they were fighting an industrialized reign of death.
However, while weapons had evolved, humans hadn't.
Soldiers were still made of flesh and bone, and they were sent to face machines that didn't tire, didn't hesitate, and didn't miss. The result? Mass casualties on an unprecedented scale. At battles like Verdun and the Somme, hundreds of thousands died in days. Days!
Then there was poison gas.
Chemical warfare was a new and terrifying innovation. Chlorine gas caused soldiers to choke and suffocate. Mustard gas blistered skin and lungs, leaving survivors with permanent injuries. Gas masks helped, but they weren't perfect. And the psychological impact of knowing that invisible death could creep through the trenches at any moment was devastating. And then came the planes. At first, aeroplanes were used for reconnaissance, spying on enemy positions, but it didn't take long for them to be fitted with machine guns and bombs. Dogfights in the skies became legendary, but on the ground, civilians were suddenly targets too. For the first time, death could rain from above. Tanks also made their debut in World War I. These armoured beasts could roll over trenches, crush barbed wire, and shrug off bullets. The early models were slow, clunky, and unreliable, but even so, they signalled a shift. War was no longer about bravery or tactics alone. It was about who could innovate the fastest.
However, here's the real kicker. Industrialization didn't just make the war deadlier, it made it longer.
In previous conflicts, armies could only fight as long as they had resources. But in World War I, factories kept the weapons coming. Nations mobilized entire populations to work on the home front, turning civilians into cogs in the war machine. Women took over factories, building the very weapons that would devastate their sons, husbands, and brothers. This constant supply of arms and ammunition meant that battles could drag on for months, even years. It wasn't about winning anymore, it was about outlasting the enemy. World War I became a war of attrition, where the goal wasn't to defeat the opponent quickly, but to grind them down until they collapsed.
Picture this. You're a soldier, huddled in a trench. You hear a high-pitched whine. It's an artillery shell, screaming towards you. Before you can react, the ground erupts. The blast throws you into the air, your ears ringing, dirt and blood everywhere. You're alive, but your comrades? They're gone. This isn't bravery or strategy or even war as you imagined it. It's survival against machines, designed to kill with industrial efficiency. Can you imagine fighting not just against another human being, but against machines, gas, and planes? What does courage even mean in a war where technology has made you obsolete?
Chapter 3. New Defense, Old Offense. The clash of ideas and technology. World War I was a brutal collision between new technologies and old school thinking. Generals, steeped in 19th century strategies, sent soldiers into battle as though they were still fighting the Napoleonic Wars.
The problem? The battlefield had changed, but their playbook hadn't.
Let's start with defence. By 1914, defensive technologies had advanced far beyond anything the world had seen before. Trenches, barbed wire, machine guns, and artillery made it nearly impossible to launch a successful offensive. Soldiers could dig in, fortify their positions, and hold the line against massive assaults. The trench was king. Stretching for hundreds of miles along the Western Front, these networks of ditches weren't just holes in the ground. They were complex systems, complete with bunkers, command posts, and supply lines. From the trenches, soldiers could hold off wave after wave of enemy attacks, at the cost of living in mud, misery, and constant fear.
But here's where it gets tragic. The generals didn't get the memo.
They still believed in the glory of the charge. The idea that soldiers could storm the enemy's position en masse, bayonets gleaming, and overwhelm them with sheer bravery. This worked when muskets and cannons were slow to reload. However, against machine guns and barbed wire, well, it was a slaughter. Take the infamous Battle of the Somme. On the first day alone, over 57,000 British soldiers were killed or wounded, most of them cut down by machine gun fire as they marched across open fields. And yet, the strategy didn't change. Time and time again, commanders ordered their men over the top, straight into a hail of bullets.
So you might be wondering, why didn't they adapt? Well, the answer lies in the mindset of the time.
Many military leaders were veterans of earlier wars, and they trusted the strategies that had worked for them in the past. They saw new technologies as mere tools to supplement traditional tactics, not as game changers. There was also a kind of stubborn pride. To admit that the old ways didn't work was to admit defeat, not just on the battlefield, but in their entire worldview. So they clung to their doctrines, even as the bodies piled up. And let's not forget communication. Unlike today, where commanders can get real-time updates, leaders in World War I often operated with very limited information. They were miles behind the front lines, relying on messengers and completely outdated reports. By the time they realized their plans weren't working, it was often too late.
Therefore, this clash of defense and offense created the infamous stalemate of World War I.
Neither side could gain significant ground, but neither could afford to back down. Battles dragged on for months, with soldiers dying for gains measured in mere yards. The human cost of this inflexibility was staggering. Millions of lives were lost because tactics hadn't caught up with technology. The bravery of the soldiers was undeniable, but their sacrifices were made in service of outdated strategies that couldn't overcome modern defenses.
Now imagine you're one of these soldiers, waiting for the whistle that means it's time to go over the top. You know what's out there: barbed wire, machine guns, and death. But you go anyway, because that's what you've been ordered to do. You charge. Not because you believe it will work, but because you have no choice. What would you do in their place? Could you follow an order you knew was doomed to fail? Well, if you didn't, you were likely to be shot by your own side anyway. And more importantly, what does it say about humanity that we let millions of lives be thrown away because we couldn't or wouldn't adapt?
Chapter 4. The horrific conditions. Living in the shadow of death. World War I wasn't just brutal because of the weapons or the tactics. It was the day-to-day existence of the soldiers that made it a living hell. Imagine enduring not just the fear of sudden death, but also the relentless grind of cold, hunger, disease, and despair.
Welcome to the trenches.
The trenches stretched for hundreds of miles, zigzagging across Europe like scars on the landscape. At first glance, they were simple ditches, but a closer look revealed a world of misery. They weren't temporary shelters, they were home.
Soldiers spent weeks, sometimes months, living in these narrow, muddy graves.
Rain turned the trenches into rivers of sludge. Soldiers were often knee-deep in mud, their feet soaked and freezing. This led to trench foot, a painful condition where skin rotted from constant moisture. Left untreated, it often meant amputation, and if the mud didn't get you, the rats might. Trenches were infested with enormous rats that fed on corpses, scurried over sleeping soldiers, and spread disease. Then there was the constant bombardment. Artillery fire wasn't just a weapon, it was a psychological assault. The deafening booms, the shaking ground, the knowledge that at any moment a shell could land in your trench, it drove many soldiers to the brink of madness. The term shell shock was coined to describe the mental trauma they endured. what we now recognise as PTSD.
Even day-to-day existence was excruciating. Forget showers or clean clothes, those luxuries didn't exist. Hygiene was almost impossible, and diseases like dysentery ran rampant.
Food was scarce, and when it came, it was often inedible. Soldiers ate hard biscuits, canned meat, and thin soup, often infested with maggots. Clean water? Rare. Many soldiers drank contaminated water, leading to illnesses like cholera. And let's not forget the boredom. When they weren't fighting, soldiers sat in the trenches with nothing to do but wait. For orders, for supplies, for death. This monotony, punctuated by moments of sheer terror, took a psychological toll that was as damaging as the physical wounds. On top of this, the elements were just as deadly as the enemy. In the summer, the heat made the trenches stink of death and decay. In the winter, freezing temperatures turned the ground into ice, and frostbite claimed fingers and toes. Soldiers fought against nature as much as they fought against each other.
So imagine this, you're 19 years old. You've left your family behind, full of dreams of glory. Now you're in a trench, soaked to the bone, your stomach empty, your feet rotting. You haven't slept in days because the artillery fire never stops. You don't know if you'll survive the next hour, let alone the war. And even if you do, you're not sure who you will be when it's all over. So what is more terrifying? The idea of dying in a place like this, or the idea of surviving it, knowing that these memories will scar you and haunt you for the rest of your life?
Chapter 5. Censorship and Propaganda. The war they wanted you to see.
Another reason this war was so brutal was the brainwashing of the populations. World War I wasn't just fought on the battlefields, it was fought in the minds of entire societies.
Governments didn't just wage war on the enemy, they waged war on truth, using censorship and propaganda to control what people knew, what they felt, and what they believed.
The result? A population swept into the war with dreams of heroism, only to have those illusions shattered by the grim reality.
Before World War I, propaganda wasn't a term most people knew. By the time the war ended, it was a cornerstone of modern warfare. Every major power had a propaganda machine, cranking out posters, pamphlets, and films designed to stir up patriotism and hatred for the enemy. Recruitment posters were particularly effective. They appealed to young men's sense of duty, adventure, and honour. Images of soldiers in crisp uniforms, flags flying, and smiling families sending their sons off to war painted a picture of service as noble, even glamorous. The message was clear. You're not just fighting for your country, you're fighting for civilization itself. For those who hesitated, guilt was the weapon of choice. Britain's famous "Your country needs you" poster shamed men into enlisting. Others played on fears, suggesting that not joining the fight made you a coward, or worse, unpatriotic. It wasn't just soldiers who were targeted, entire populations were fed carefully curated narratives. Governments framed the war as a moral crusade, a fight between good and evil. The enemy was dehumanized through caricatures and stories of atrocities. German soldiers, for example, were depicted as barbaric Huns who committed unspeakable acts, whether true or not.
This dehumanization served a purpose. It made the war seem just. After all, who wouldn't want to fight against evil incarnate? The propaganda wasn't just about inspiring soldiers, it was about ensuring the support of civilians, who would have to endure rations, shortages, and the loss of loved ones.
While propaganda built a fantasy, censorship hid the truth. Letters from soldiers were heavily monitored. Anything that hinted at the horrors of the trenches, disease, death, or disillusionment was removed. Families back home received sanitized updates, creating a gap between their understanding of the war and the soldiers' lived experience. Newspapers were no better. Journalists who dared to report on the grim realities of the front lines risked imprisonment. Instead, the headlines were filled with stories of victories, heroics, and the righteousness of the cause. Photographs of the dead or maimed were rare. Governments knew that showing the true cost of war might undermine public support.
But perhaps the most tragic aspect of this censorship and propaganda was the way it manipulated the youth.
Young men signed up in droves, swept up by dreams of glory fed to them by their schools, churches, and governments. Many lied about their age just to enlist, some as young as 15. These boys, brimming with enthusiasm, were sent straight into the grinder. The contrast between the world they had imagined and the reality they were facing was devastating. They didn't return as heroes, many didn't return at all. Those who survived often felt betrayed by their leaders, by their society, and by the ideals that had lured them to the front.
However, when the war ended and the truth began to emerge, it shattered the public's faith in institutions. The idealism that had fueled the war was replaced by cynicism and disillusionment. Writers and artists of what became known as the Lost Generation captured this shift, showing a world forever scarred by its naivety. Imagine being a young soldier writing a letter home. You want to tell your family about the mud, the fear, all the friends you've seen brutally killed. But you know they'll never read those words. Your letter will be censored, so you lie. You tell them you're fine, that it's not so bad, that you're proud to serve. And they believe you, because that's what all the posters and the newspapers say too. Now imagine being that soldier's mother, reading that letter. You're proud of him, of course, but you do not know the truth. You don't know that he's living in absolute hell. How would it feel to realise after the war that everything you were told was a lie? Is it worse to endure the horrors of war or to live in ignorance of them, believing in a noble cause that was never real?
Chapter 6. The Futility of the Huge Human Cost. A sacrifice without meaning.
World War I was supposed to be the war that ended all wars. Instead, it became a grim testament to the sheer futility of conflict on such an unimaginable scale.
Millions of lives were lost, entire landscapes were obliterated, and societies were forever scarred, all for outcomes so minor they measured in inches rather than miles.
Let's break down just how meaningless much of the suffering actually was.
The most infamous battles of the war are monuments to futility. Take the Battle of the Somme. It's lasted for over 4 months, cost over 1 million lives on both sides, and resulted in a territorial gain for the Allies of just 6 miles. 6 miles? That's less than a 10-minute drive. Or consider the Battle of Verdun. The German strategy was literally to bleed the French army dry. They didn't even want to win territory. They just wanted to kill as many French soldiers as possible. By the end, over 700,000 men were dead, wounded or missing, and neither side had gained a strategic advantage. These battles epitomised the war of attrition, where victory wasn't measured by tactical brilliance, but by who could endure the most losses. It was a deadly stalemate, where human lives became just another expendable resource.
Part of the problem lay with the leadership.
Far removed from the front lines, many generals treated the war like a giant chessboard, moving pieces without fully grasping the human cost. Soldiers weren't individuals, they were numbers, statistics in a grand strategy. And when those strategies didn't work, well, the solution was often more of the same. Send more men, dig deeper trenches, launch another assault. The idea was that overwhelming force would eventually break the enemy, but all it broke was millions of lives. For the soldiers, this futility wasn't an abstract concept, it was their daily reality. Imagine going over the top in a massive charge, knowing full well that the last wave of men didn't even make it halfway to the enemy's trench. Imagine surviving one of these battles, only to be sent back to do it all again the next day. The result was a kind of collective despair. Many soldiers lost faith, not just in their leaders, but in the very idea of the war. They realised they weren't fighting for glory, or honour, or even victory. They were fighting because they had no other choice.
The numbers are staggering. Over 9 million soldiers dead. Another 7 million civilians killed. Tens of millions more maimed and wounded, both physically and mentally. And what did it achieve? A fragile armistice that barely lasted 2 decades before war erupted again. Even for those who survived, the war left scars that never healed. The lost generation, those that came of age during the war, returned home to a world that did not understand their trauma. So many completely failed to reintegrate, haunted by memories of comrades and friends that they left behind. And here's the cruel irony. Most of the major powers involved in the war didn't even achieve their original aims.
The Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Ottoman Empire collapsed entirely. Germany, saddled with crushing reparations, was left humiliated and resentful, setting the stage for World War II. Russia, destabilized by the war, fell into revolution, leading to the rise of communism. Even the so-called winners were left economically and socially devastated. Britain and France lost entire generations of young men. Their economies were crippled, their colonies increasingly restless. The war had reshaped the world, but not for the better.
Imagine being a soldier at the end of the war. You've survived years of absolute untold horror. You've watched friends die, be blown apart, endured wounds, and seen villages turn to rubble, their populations killed or forced to flee. And then you hear the news. The war is over. But what did you fight for? What did you sacrifice for? The world definitely isn't better. It's completely broken. And so are you. Can you imagine giving everything, your mind, your body, your life, only to realise it was all for nothing? What does it do to a person? Hell, what does it do to a generation to know that the price they paid didn't buy anything of value?
Chapter 7. The gigantic post-war consequences. The war that never really ended. World War I didn't just end with an armistice. It's left behind a shattered world, one that would grapple with its consequences for decades. Empires collapsed, ideologies rose, and the seeds of future conflicts were sown into the smouldering aftermath. If the war itself was brutal, its legacy was equally devastating, reshaping the political, social, and economic fabric of the 20th century.
One of the most immediate and dramatic consequences of the First World War was the fall of four major empires: the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire, and the German Empire. These weren't just political collapses, they were the disintegration of entire ways of life.
The Austro-Hungarian Empire splintered into a patchwork of new nations, such as Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. This fragmentation created a power vacuum in Central and Eastern Europe, fueling tensions that would explode in World War II. The Ottoman Empire, once a dominant force in the Middle East, was carved up by Western powers. Its territories were divided into British and French mandates, planting the roots of modern conflicts in the region. And the Russian Empire's collapse led directly to the Bolshevik Revolution, ushering in the Soviet Union and the rise of communism, which would dominate global politics for much of the 20th century. However, perhaps the most damning was the Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919 and designed to secure peace.
But it did the opposite.
Germany was forced to accept full responsibility for the war, pay crippling reparations, and disarm its military. The treaty was a humiliation, stoking resentment and economic hardship in Germany. This created fertile ground for radical ideologies, paving the way for Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party. But it wasn't just Germany that was unhappy. Italy, despite being on the winning side, felt it hadn't received the rewards it deserved, fueling discontent that would later support Mussolini's rise. Japan, also an ally, felt snubbed, sowing resentment that would play a role in its expansionist ambitions in the 1930s. The devastation and disillusionment of the war gave rise to ideologies that promised to rebuild broken societies. Communism gained traction in Russia and beyond, offering a vision of equality in the face of widespread suffering. Meanwhile, fascism emerged in Italy and Germany, offering strong leadership and national pride to populations desperate for stability and purpose. This ideological divide, communism versus fascism, set the stage for the geopolitical tensions that would define the 20th century, including the Cold War, and leading right up to the modern day.
Imagine this. The war is over. The guns have fallen silent. But instead of peace, the world is in chaos. Entire empires have vanished. Economies are in ruins. Families are grieving for lost sons, brothers, and fathers all over the world. And as you look around, it's clear the fighting may have stopped, but the wounds it left behind will shape the world for generations. What if World War I wasn't the end of something, but only the beginning of a century of pain, death, and conflict? When the cost is so high, how do you measure if it was worth it? And more importantly, who even gets to make that choice? Let me know what you think in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to my channel.